The US Vice President Mike Pence has reiterated America's determination to curb North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Speaking in Sydney after meeting Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, he said Pyongyang posed the biggest risk to the Asia-Pacific region. Mr. Pence talked about the changes of achieving a nuclear-free Korean peninsula.
For more than a generation, there's been a consensus in the world community for a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. In the 1990s, it was a subject of negotiations, and an agreed framework was arrived at. Six-party talks would follow sometime later. The last administration embraced a policy of strategic patience. All along the way, the regime in North Korea answered the entreaties of the world community with broken promises and with continued pursuit, headlong pursuit, of their nuclear and ballistic missile ambitions. And as President Trump has made clear, and I've made clear as I travel on his behalf throughout this region, the era of strategic patience is over. Under the President's leadership and working closely with our allies, with Prime Minister Turnbull, and my meetings with Prime Minister Abe, and with Acting President Wang in South Korea and others, the United States is determined to bring economic and diplomatic pressure to bear, working with all of our allies and China to ensure that we achieve a nuclear-free Korean peninsula.
Well, let's go live to Sydney and speak to our correspondent there, Hal Griffith. Good to see you, Hal. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Pence mentioned North Korea quite high up in that news conference, and that is because Australia is a very important ally in the region for the US.
Absolutely. Australia is seen as some kind of guardian, really, from the US's point of view, that can bring it good contact with China and other key players in the area. Now, one phrase we heard from the Vice President over and over again was that all options remain on the table when it comes to dealing with North Korea. He stressed that US naval vessels, why there may have been, maybe he said, some misunderstanding over their presence in the region, they would be occupying a space that gave them the ability to act if needs be. However, counterbalance to that, he spoke about the importance of China, and what he says and what President Trump believes are encouraging signs from China about their willingness to act and take advantage of what he says their unique economic role, their unique lifeline they provide North Korea in imposing sanctions and bringing the regime into line to ensure that the nuclear situation there doesn't become even hotter.
Now, what would have been good news for Malcolm Turnbull, he would have been happy to hear that Mike Pence did honour the deal with Australia to resettle refugees. Now, this was at the heart of that awkward conversation back in January, wasn't it?
Absolutely awkward, yes. A phone call that really went pear-shaped in many ways. So to give you some background, this deal to accept up to 1,250 refugees currently at an offshore detention centre off of Australia was agreed in the Obama administration. Wasn't much liked by President Trump when he took over, calling it a dumb deal on Twitter. Since then, massive confusion of what's going to happen to these people. Vice President Pence reaffirmed, he said, that the White House will honour, if not admire, the agreement and will consider these people for refugee resettlement. However, he also stressed that they will be subject to the same extreme vetting we've heard so much about from the US. So it's by no means certain that the majority or even a large number of these people would eventually end up in the US. So I think while Malcolm Turnbull, the Australian Prime Minister, will have smiled at hearing that, in the back of his mind, he and many people, he'll be wondering exactly how many people will eventually end up in the US.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear Mike Pence talk about the historic ties between the two countries, because he would know as well as you do that Australia has been exploring the idea of looking more towards China than its old ally, the US. So Mike Pence very, very keen to strengthen those old ties.
Absolutely, and the big stress on the sort of military history shared between the countries going back 99 years and the current actions in the Middle East, for example, in the fight against IS. So both men, I think, in accord, that's where their closest cooperation is at the moment militarily, and they'll see that going forward with the tension in the Korean Peninsula, with actions in the Middle East and on all of the frontiers. Trade was the one other bit of a discussion. The TPP having been scrapped, Australia was very keen to build up that grand alliance economically. However, they know the US is pretty happy with the bilateral deal it has with Australia at the moment. And so we'll see that one continue, I think.
Hal, good to talk to you. Hal Griffith there, live in Sydney for us.